Books.
Only one writer had complete access to the World Trade Center site after September 11, 2001, William Langewiesche. His new book, American Ground, chronicles the 5 months he spent with firemen, policemen, construction workers, and engineers as they embarked on a massive recovery effort. This program is about an hour.
Tonight, it's a pleasure to introduce William Langewiesche, the national correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly and the author of the book American Ground, which was serialized in 3 parts in the Atlantic Monthly. Mr. Langewiesche is the author of several other books, including Cutting for Ground, about the Mexican-American border, A Wonderful Meditation on Flight, and currently the most recent book, American Ground, which was a thoroughly researched and incredibly grueling account of what it took to take away what he, I think, estimated to be 90% of the remains of the Trade Center, all of which was still at the site after the collapse. He can tell all of you this better than I can, and the way the evening will go is that we will have Mr. Langewiesche read and talk. There will be a brief Q&A from the audience, and that will be followed by a press briefing at the end of it. Mr. William Langewiesche.
Well, thank you all for being here. These circumstances are obviously unusual for book reading, and I'd like to just talk about that a little bit to lay a little of the scope first, before proceeding to some of the more traditional aspects of a book reading. This book, which was a 3-part Atlantic series, was the result of extensive reporting at the site and a serious commitment by me, the Atlantic, and Ferris Strauss to do what I think of and thought of at the time as writing and observing history in the present tense. It was very obvious to me, I'm an American, that this was emotional terrain. It was emotional for me. I mean, I felt the same shock I think that all Americans felt. I did not feel the same grief that the families felt who lost people, but I felt the fundamental shock of this attack, and I recognized the very serious nature of it and the very serious nature of the response. I took that seriously, in other words. It was my goal from the beginning not to write about the events of 9/11, but to write about how the United States, in this very specific and confined space, reacted to it. This was not a book of generalizations. This is a book of precise observations. The observations were either eyewitness observations or based on sources that were extremely reliable and had proved themselves to be reliable in close collaboration over months of intense work. Very early on, I passed the boundary between observer and participant on an emotional level and on other levels. In fact, I think of the American Ground series as being a form of participation, and probably a useful one. So, having said that, it is not surprising. I mean, it is not as if I didn't know what the emotional terrain there was. I was very aware of it. In fact, I wrote about it. And I, in fact, have enormous sympathy, not only for the people who lost family there, and I met and talked to many of them, though I never wrote about them during my time at the site, but also for people like the firemen, who were members of fraternal organizations that were very heavily hit. I have no doubt about the sincerity of the emotions outside tonight. And I also think, this is a book called American Ground, that differing perspectives are entirely legitimate, and I accept that wholeheartedly. I am an American. In fact, this book is about, to a large extent, that. The problem is that it's not about a sort of lockstep patriotism, but something more fundamentally healthy that was going on there, and it is a celebration of the United States. So, having said that, as sort of a groundwork for, I will read a little bit here, and then talk to you a little bit, and then we might have a little Q&A. This book originally started as the idea being simply an engineering book. I should also say that along with the focus of this book being the events following 9/11, the focus was not on the tragedy or the tragic aspects of it, but on the other sort of active aspects of the response, not the recognition of sorrow, which we all had, which was relatively easy for us to recognize. Enough said. How do you feel? I feel bad. But the more complicated thing that was going on, which was very positive actually in this very sad ground, and that was this practical American looking forward, moving forward, rushing forward into a solution. Originally, it was going to be about the engineering only. How do you unengineer this tangled mess with an acknowledgement of the symbolic importance here? And political importance. But of course, very rapidly it became something else. It became the story and something more interesting and ultimately more hopeful about the United States. It became the story of a raw cultural emergence that said a lot about who we as a country are, and what it said was very hopeful. That is what this book is. The site. The site roared 24 hours a day for 9 full months and beyond. From autumn through winter and into spring, the crews labored in 12-hour shifts, got some sleep, and came back for more. The enormous scale of the workplace is difficult to convey. Under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's insistence that New York return quickly to normal, the restricted zone had shrunk by late September to 40 downtown blocks bounded by Chambers, Broadway, Rector, and the Hudson River, which was still a large area to be out of commission. At the heart of it, under the skeletal walls rising to 150 feet above the street, the debris spread across 17 acres in smoldering mounds. It was dangerous ground, of course. Workers at the site called it simply the pile. In detail, the topography was complex with strange craters and caves, unstable cliffs, and unexpected remnants of the World Trade Center as it had been before, the torn sculptural sphere on the ruined plaza, the amputated stores with their displays of goods no longer for sale, a row of bicycles still securely chained to a rack, a lamppost here or there still standing. Passers-by peering at the ruins from afar, from beyond the perimeter fences along Broadway or Chambers, sometimes expressed amazement that 210-story buildings could collapse into a mass that was relatively so small. But there was no mystery to the dimensions. Because the Twin Towers had been as much 90% air and 10% structure, they had contained the equivalent of approximately 11 solid stories of steel and concrete, and beneath these uneven mounds, which stood 5 stories high and spilled into the streets, their remnants filled the foundation hole to bedrock 6 levels down. Indeed, from the workers' close-in view, the ruins accounted for the former buildings all too precisely. It became apparent that the initial release of powdered concrete into the air, however large it had been, had amounted to an insignificant proportion of the total weight, and that almost every pound of the original structure remained to be extracted, inspected, and hauled away. So the ruins were not small at all. On the scale of people at the site, they were in fact gargantuan, not mounds, but mountains that reduced the expeditions venturing out across them to ant-sized columns traversing steel slopes. More than 1.5 million tons of heavy steel and debris lay densely compacted there, tied together like steel wool and complicated by the existence of human remains. The weight alone defied imagination. What does a chaos of 1.5 million tons really mean? What does it even look like? The scene up close was so large that no one quite knew. In other countries, clear answers would have been sought before action was taken. Learned committees would have been formed and high authorities consulted. The ruins would have been pondered, and a tightly scripted response would have been imposed. Barring that, soldiers would have assumed control. But for whatever reasons, probably cultural, probably profound, little of the sort happened here, where the learned committees were excluded and the soldiers were relegated to the unhappy role of guarding the perimeter, and civilians and heavy machines simply rolled in and took on the unknown. The most effective of these machines were giant diesel excavators, tracked monsters with hydraulic arms and grappler claws that could tear tangles or close around sections of heavy beams and worry them clear of the pile's embrace. They were voracious, incautious, ignorant, and unstoppable. Soon there were dozens of them in action, painted orange or yellow, working in tandem to daisy chain the debris down to the trucking operation in the streets, straining under their loads, with smoke and dust rising around them and flames licking their claws. For months, this was how the unbuilding went, like a dance of dinosaurs in a volcanic land of steel, with men there too, moving through, restlessly searching for their kind. The effects were astonishing. Though the enormousness of the ruins made the final goal of a clean hull seem remote and difficult to imagine, the surface features of the pile changed so fast that time itself was compressed, and memories just a week old grew faint. People got caught up in that. Many of the core group were camped in hotels or temporary apartments nearby. The smart ones reminded themselves that they had recently led ordinary lives and that they would return to them. But weeks felt like months, and months like years, and as winter came, it was ordinary life and not the sight that began to seem dreamlike and far away. That's enough reading. You're all New Yorkers, I'm sure. You all know exactly what I'm talking about, at least seen from the outside. The real story here, however, was not this debris, this terrain, but the ability, as I mentioned in this reading, of the American system to allow the unexpected to happen. I saw it very early, and I realized that here on this ground, in this chaos, was a piece of America which could not be spun, okay? It was a piece of America for which there would be no public relations, no real political input for a long time, not even engineering and safety plans. None of it meant anything there. And emerging in that chaos and from that chaos was something very real, almost by definition, about what the United States is at this time, or was at this time of enormous stress for all of us. What I saw emerging, as I alluded to in what I wrote here, was the ability of the American system, having thrown up a pretty opaque perimeter around this site, an act of brilliance, to allow the unexpected players to play, to allow people who are not anointed either by action plans or by society at large to emerge, and often in ways that could not have been predicted. That was the common denominator of the people who rose to power and took the most effective action and were allowed to take the most effective action at the Trade Center site. And that common denominator was that they were unexpected. Mayor Giuliani, who received much credit, well-deserved, for his basically courageous response to the attack in the days that followed, at a time when all of us felt fear. Mayor Giuliani did something that has not really been acknowledged, and that, in my opinion, as someone on the inside, was the true act of brilliance. And that was to allow this to happen, not to impose the OEM plans, not to allow, or basically to negotiate and to persuade people who were already willing to be persuaded for ideological reasons. This was an American, not a New York story. For ideological reasons, there were people in the federal government, in the Office of Emergency Management, who were equally brilliant, who were equally willing to put their money where their mouth is in terms of ideology and theoretical understanding of how to go about this reaction to the crime and tragedy of September 11th. Also, apparently, though I don't know this firsthand, the governor's office was involved in this decision, but I know it was a formal decision. It was a conscious decision. It was precarious, day by day, actually hour by hour in the beginning, and then day by day, at a time when there was no real structure on the inside of that perimeter, when there were probably 15 people who were sort of in charge, and maybe each of them had a slightly more pyramidical view of the structure than actually was warranted. At a time when there truly was chaos in terms of the reactions, physical reactions and planning on the ground within that perimeter. These people encouraged it, allowed it to happen. And I have recently run into some people at the Pentagon who have read this book with some interest, because they've told me that it exhibits something they call swarming behavior, and the people in the military are looking at. erect the perimeter, and let people do what they can. Let the natural leaders emerge. Apparently also on this book tour, I have been told on this book tour that apparently on D-Day, the Normandy invasion, there was a very similar reaction as the structure bore the brunt of the German defense and was of command. The structure command bore that attack, basically, and was shattered. The unexpected ones rose up and took command and made decisions that were very important to the success of that particular invasion. I'm not surprised. In other words, I don't think that what we're looking at here at the Trade Center site only happens at the Trade Center. Far from it. I mean, I think that this is a fundamentally American thing, and it was heartening to see it in our modern times. Now, I can give you a few examples of people who did rise up. This book is really the story of those people. This book is a story of their success and of success in general, not a failure. I'll name two of them. One of them I expected here tonight, and I think he has not, as best I know, showed up, I understand. Peter Rinaldi. Peter Rinaldi was the man who came in, he was a Port Authority engineer. He came into the site after the first week. As you all know, the Port Authority, being New Yorkers, is a highly paternalistic organization. It's a cocoon for the people who work there. It is in many ways a very effective organization. Of course, it was the owner of the Trade Center, Peter Rinaldi, who lost his offices, and many of his friends who died there had suffered through the shock of that, like the Port Authority itself, had retreated to New Jersey temporarily, and was one of the first people sent by the Port Authority onto the site. I remember when he came in, he was an engineer. I remember seeing what I thought of as something close to, well, certainly the deep uncertainty in his eyes. This was a man who had had his cocoon stripped away from him for the first time in life. He was standing in the wind. He was going to have to make decisions here that were critical, and this is when when survivors were still being sought. Decisions that were critical and on which lives depended, about specific technical removal problems, especially underground. And Rinaldi, I realized that Rinaldi was not afraid for himself, because I accompanied Rinaldi right away on some very risky trips underground. And you could see that he was not afraid of dying, and he was not afraid of physical injury, but he was afraid of, I think saying afraid is too strong a word, but he was legitimately concerned with being exposed to the wind for the first time, professional time in his life. And with the story of the Trade Center that runs all through this book is the story of Peter Rinaldi's emergence. I mean, not only did Peter Rinaldi learn things about himself and discover these enormous strengths that he had inside of him that had never come out before, that had not sort of been allowed to, the independence of thought and the necessary balance between aggression and timidity. Others learned it about him too. That was part of the brilliance. These were not just people discovering things about themselves. This was the new society, the new hidden culture of the Trade Center site, discovering it about them too and acknowledging it and allowing them to go forward. Rinaldi was one. He rose to enormous power within the site and became the one engineer who needed to be consulted on just about everything, and not just below ground, but above ground as well. It was his fundamental judgment rather than his technical knowledge, his ability to stand in the wind and to operate without committees and memos that really counted. This was then finally because the United States is a society in which people can move beyond what they were before. Not that Rinaldi was a mid-level, even a high-level engineer, but now he is the man who's running the Port Authority, the Trade Center site. So that's one case. Another case, a little bit more difficult maybe, is my friend Mike Burton. Burton, who became known, who was called by the press as the czar of the Trade Center site, was driven by first of all, like everybody there, a personal need to react effectively to the terror of the attack, a need to respond as a human being, let alone as an American, to what had happened. He also, I think, was personally a very ambitious man, and he grew to understand that this was an important moment for him. And it was, and there was nothing wrong with that. And I've written frankly about him, as I've written frankly about everything that I saw or actually thought in the first person at this site. In the case of Mike Burton, he has not been entirely happy with what I wrote. And I've talked to him about this. We have talked in some detail and in some depth about this, and I've said that my role, unfortunately, is to be frank. And I will say things that I believe are correct, even if they are impolite, and even if they are offensive to a man I count as a friend, for instance. I believe in some way he's accepting of that at this point. That remains to be seen. Essentially, this book is a story of the intertwining of these characters. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about it, and as pertains somewhat to what's going on outside tonight. If you had to pick a turning point for the people who were doing the unbuilding, and let me remind you, I was writing about the unbuilders here, originally an engineering story. It was a crisis of emotion, somewhat like that tonight. It was a meeting that occurred at the time when the city government was beginning to wrest control of the site from the fire department. And a meeting of widows was called. Giuliani was there, Mike Burton, the czar, was there, his lieutenant, Bill Cody, was there, and the medical examiner was there. There may have been a few others I'm not aware of. At that site, at that meeting, which was extremely emotional, I believe it was held in the Sheraton, I may be wrong about that, I was not there. As in many cases here, I was told this by very reliable people multiple times. At that meeting, things got very, very emotional. There was finally no response possible for a guy like the medical examiner or for Mike Burton, who simply stood up and took the heat. It was an outpouring of emotion that was beyond conversation. But rather than just rejecting it, which was certainly what one might expect from some engineers in the construction business who were interested in pure efficiency and let's get this job done, and by the way, we're personally ambitious. Rather than just rejecting it, there was a reassessment that occurred at that point. And the czar, Mike Burton and Bill Cody, went to have a beer. They were very shocked. And they recognized to each other that the emotions that they had just encountered, difficult though they were to answer, were very, very real, very legitimate, and they needed to take this into account. They did not stiff-arm the emotions mentally. The struggle continued. The struggle continued to the very end between efficiency and memorialism, you could say, between looking ahead and looking back. That struggle continued. But Burton and Cody and the rest of them who were in the unbuilding, on the unbuilding side, recognized the validity of the opposition. I recognize the validity of the opposition. It's really a very similar thing. I'll tell you one more thing and then close it. There was at the site a shared understanding, despite the divisions that I have written about, because I write frankly about things. Despite the fact that indeed those divisions were growing as the media hype on the outside continued to pump it. You could go too far, as I've made very clear in this book, repeatedly, many times over, in taking those divisions out. You could go too far in blowing those divisions out of proportion. Ultimately at the site, put it this way, this is a piece of American ground. We in the United States have many arguments and serious arguments and emotional arguments. We disagree often. That is what this country is about. That is what that is about outside. And we also ultimately submit to the Constitution. There is that shared understanding. And we are not the Ivory Coast. We do not divide terminally over these things, but understand that there is a higher order that has to come into play at some point. That was very true at the site. This was an American ground, a piece of it. It was not the Ivory Coast. And despite the divisions that existed there, there was an understanding of the severity of the attack, the level of personal tragedy for thousands of people who had lost family at the site, and the need to take that into account, to rise above the divisions and the pettiness, which is certainly part of the story, as it is in the United States, to rise above stupidity, which was part of the story, as it is in the United States, to unite around the act of brilliance and innovation, which is part of the United States, and to move forward to an effective solution. That's what happened at the Trade Center site. I think at that point, I should just end it. I could talk about this for a long time, but I think it's better to have a short Q&A and then cut it at that point, given the conditions of the evening.
If you're going to ask a question, please wait for the boom mic to arrive so that you will be picked up on the tape. Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about what was found down at Ground Zero, because you didn't discuss that at all in your talk, and I live about 2 blocks away from Ground Zero. About 2 weeks after the attack, I was told by many different police officers that I happen to know personally that they found the fire truck with the Gap jeans there. And I read that once, maybe 2 months after that, in a little blurb in an article on like page 62 somewhere. That was the last I heard of it. It was the last anybody ever spoke about it. Now, I didn't read your book yet, I just bought it, okay? I suspect that that was mentioned in there, and that's why these guys are outside yelling liar. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what evidence you have about that?
Let me tell you what the nature of what I was writing about, okay, again, was what happened afterward, all right? Yes, in this book, I reported that, okay? I reported it because people who had proved to be reliable to me, very steady, who were active on the pile, had told me about it, and then I had sought and found further verification of the details, all right? And I had, but my interest in it was never what actually had happened, an explanation. I didn't care, and in fact, specifically, what I wrote was not about that. I did not jump to conclusions, okay? What I did do was describe the effect that had on the pile, on the culture there. That was my subject. In context, therefore, what I was writing about, and masking all identities, and with no conclusions, no implications, was what was happening when I was there, not what had happened on September 11th. That was not my subject. Therefore, to tell you the truth, I don't know, and that's not my subject, okay? The specific story which has caused so much turmoil needs to be taken in context. It needs to be taken in context both of what I wrote, and more specifically, it needs to be taken in context of a site that was not a normal part of America in that sense, but was a battlefield. Things happen on battlefields that cannot be measured by normal standards. And I understand that, and I wrote in those terms. I think there may be a boom mic problem there.
Okay. The other thing is, was there anything in your book, and I appreciate your explanation on that, shortly after the attacks, the local administration, the politicians, everything, did everything they could to keep ordinary citizens away from the site.
Right.
They erected barricades.
Right.
Not only did they erect barricades, but they also put a perma-hedge or covering
Right.
over it. So ordinary citizens who felt the need to go there or be there or see completely, cops were there pushing people away. You can't come here, you have to leave. I live in the area, and that went on probably for about 2 months, 2.5 months. All during the time they were marching celebrities down there, football players, autographing football helmets, but ordinary citizens who had the same urges, the same desires to go there and just do whatever it is they do, were kept away even from the visual sense of it. Was there anything?
I couldn't agree with you more, okay? In other words, I remember those. I was involved in. I remember those conversations. I was there when the orders were coming on, not only to erect the perimeter, to make it strong, but to make it opaque. Okay, we know that there was a sort of an implied insult against anyone who wanted to come down and look, as if people were voyeurs. Okay, I found it so misguided and such a fundamental. I could not imagine being in New York and not, as an American, wanting to come down there. I also asked around the site quite a lot because I was so astonished by that policy. And I thought, given the sense of possession that was at that site, people who were on the inside did have a sense that this is my disaster more than yours, just as New York had a feeling this is my disaster more than yours for the rest of the U.S., there was that staggered sense of possession. Okay, given that reality, psychological reality, which I'm told is very much a part of all disasters, I expected that people on the inside would say, yeah, those people on the outside should stay away. They're just, peeping Toms. They didn't. I never found a single person on the inside, a single person who agreed with that policy. Those who knew, who understood what was going on, the significance of what was going on, felt it needed to be shared. Okay, and in fact, finally, the administration, the City Hall, woke up to that, and there was a viewing platform. It just took a while. It's, in a way, look, there was a lot of confusion. There were other things going on. The natural and bureaucratic instinct was close it off. And you also need to admit, that this opaque perimeter, though it was an implied insult against legitimate curiosity, was also a very important factor in what happened on the inside of that site, because it had to be opaque to some degree for people to be creative and honest in there and to take the kind of risks that almost everybody at the site was taking, both intellectual, career, and physical risks that were going on inside there. You couldn't expose that to the view of the outside world because they would, at the very least, cry safety violation. Yes.
What was your original intent when you went down to the site? You went on the 12th?
I don't know the actual date. No, it's certainly not on the 12th. It was I got there about a week after the buildings came down.
Was it your intent to stay there and write?
No. It was. I was curious to see whether, as an Atlantic writer, whether there would be an engineering story here. I certainly had no political intent, no agenda. I'm not a New Yorker. I had no New York political intent of any kind, as I do not now have either. And I went there to look at the possibility of what proved to be, what promised to be perhaps an interesting engineering story, and then it blossomed beyond that very rapidly, very rapidly. Yes?
I recall reading, I think in one of the articles, the severity of the possibility of Lower Manhattan being completely flooded. If you could elaborate on that.
No, I think that's probably a slight overstatement. There was in the first moments of the attack, when the buildings fell, there was concern about what was known as sequential flooding if the path tubes had failed, which they did not. Once that was solved, and there was no problem, concrete, as you probably know, concrete plugs were built in New Jersey. The problem was solved. And then there was, however, a very real problem, serious problem with flooding at the site itself. I spent quite a lot of time in this book discussing the story of the South Slurry Wall that began to fail, and through enormous efforts and really brilliant work and courageous work by many people, that problem was solved. So essentially, flooding never turned out to be the problem that could have been, but on several occasions it could have been a very serious problem. Well, I would like to thank you all very much for coming here, and I appreciate your doing that in these circumstances.
William Langewiesche is author of American Ground, Unbuilding the World Trade Center. It's published by North Point Press, an imprint of Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Visit fsgbooks.com